The iron shackles around Elena Morrison's wrists had worn bloody grooves into her skin after 3 months in the basement of the Whitmore mansion. The daughter of a humble blacksmith had committed the unforgivable sin of saying no to the most powerful family in Copper Ridge, Tennessee. But what Judge Harrison Whitmore didn't know was that the Cherokee blood running through Elena's veins carried secrets that would shake the very foundations of his corrupt empire, and that someone was coming for her who would stop at nothing to see justice served. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. October 1847, Copper Ridge, Tennessee. The morning mist clung to the Cumberland Mountains like ghostly fingers as Elena Morrison worked the bellows in her father's forge, her calloused hands moving with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd been shaping metal since childhood. At 19, she possessed a rare combination of fierce independence and gentle compassion that made her beloved by the working families of Copper Ridge, while simultaneously marking her as dangerous to those who preferred their women submissive. And silent, the acrid smell of hot iron filled the small workshop where Thomas Morrison had built his reputation as the finest blacksmith in 3 counties. His daughter had proven herself equally skilled with hammer and anvil, though few men in 1847 Tennessee were willing to admit that a woman could match their craftsmanship. Elena didn't care about their recognition. She cared about the work itself, the satisfaction of transforming raw metal into something useful and beautiful. "Eleanor," her father called from the doorway, his weathered face creased with concern. "Young Whitmore's coming up the road with his usual entourage. Best you make yourself scarce until they're gone." Elena's jaw tightened as she set down her hammer. Nathaniel Whitmore, the 25-year-old son of Judge Harrison Whitmore, had been pursuing her with increasing aggression for the past 6 months. His courtship consisted mainly of crude advances, expensive gifts she refused to accept, and thinly veiled threats about what happened to families who didn't show proper respect to the Whitmore name. "I'm not hiding from him anymore, Papa," Elena said firmly, wiping her hands on her leather apron. "This is our forge, our livelihood. He has no right to drive me from my own workplace." Thomas Morrison looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and terror. Elena had inherited more than just her late mother's Cherokee features, the high cheekbones, the thick black hair, and the dark eyes that seemed to see straight through deception. She'd also inherited her mother's stubborn refusal to bow to authority simply because it demanded submission. "Child, you don't understand the kind of power that family wields," Thomas said quietly. "Judge Whitmore controls the courts, the sheriff's office, half the businesses in town. Cross them, and we could lose everything." Elena had heard this warning countless times, but she'd also witnessed firsthand what happened to families who tried to appease the Whitmores. The Hendersons had lost their farm when they couldn't pay the judge's inflated legal fees. The widow Patterson had been evicted from her home when she refused to sell to Whitmore's development company for a fraction of its value. Submission to the Whitmores meant slow strangulation, not protection. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied by the kind of boisterous laughter that comes from young men who've never faced real consequences for their actions. Elena straightened her shoulders and moved to stand beside the forge, her hand resting on the handle of a heavy iron poker. She wouldn't start trouble, but she wouldn't run from it either. Nathaniel Whitmore dismounted from his expensive bay gelding with the fluid grace of someone who'd been riding since childhood, but there was something predatory in his movements that made Elena's skin crawl. He was handsome in the conventional sense, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of refined features that came from generations of careful breeding. But his pale blue eyes held a coldness that no amount of charm could disguise. "Miss Morrison," he said with an elaborate bow that mocked the very courtesy he pretended to show, "you're looking particularly lovely this morning. Hard work agrees." "With you, Mr. Whitmore," Elena replied with polite coolness. If you're here about the horseshoes for your father's carriage horses, they'll be ready by Thursday, as promised." Nathaniel's smile faltered slightly at her businesslike tone. He was accustomed to the giggling deference of the town's eligible young women, most of whom saw marriage to a Whitmore as their highest possible aspiration. Elena's indifference clearly frustrated him. "Actually, I'm here on a more personal matter," Nathaniel said, stepping closer despite the barrier of the anvil between them. "I've been thinking about our conversation last week, and I believe you may have misunderstood my intentions." Elena remembered their conversation perfectly. Nathaniel had cornered her behind the church after Sunday service, pressed her against the wall, and suggested that she could make life much easier for herself and her father by being more accommodating to his advances. When she'd pushed him away and told him exactly what she thought of his proposition, he'd responded with threats, thinly disguised as concern for her family's welfare. "I understood your intentions perfectly, Mr. Whitmore," Elena said evenly. "My answer remains the same." The two young men flanking Nathaniel, his cousins Marcus and Dylan Whitmore, exchanged glances that suggested this rejection was more serious than a simple romantic disappointment. Elena had noticed how the Whitmore men seemed to view women as property to be acquired rather than people to be respected. Her continued refusal wasn't just frustrating Nathaniel's desires. It was challenging the family's fundamental belief in their right to take whatever they wanted. "Elena," Nathaniel said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I don't think you appreciate the advantages that would come with accepting my proposal. My family has plans for this town, plans that will bring prosperity and progress to everyone who has the wisdom to align themselves with our vision." "And what about those who don't share your vision?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer from observing the Whitmore's previous business dealings. Nathaniel's smile became genuinely predatory. "Well, progress sometimes requires difficult decisions. Those who resist change often find themselves left behind, sometimes in quite unfortunate circumstances." Thomas Morrison stepped forward from the doorway, his face pale but his voice steady. "Mr. Whitmore, if you're threatening my daughter—" "Threatening?" Nathaniel laughed, the sound carrying no warmth whatsoever. "Mr. Morrison, I'm simply pointing out economic realities. The town council is considering new regulations for businesses operating within the town limits. Fire safety codes, building standards, licensing requirements. These changes could prove quite expensive for small operators who lack proper connections." The threat was crystal clear. Accept Nathaniel's advances, or watch the family business be regulated out of existence through trumped-up violations and impossible compliance costs. It was the same strategy the Whitmores had used to acquire dozens of properties and businesses over the past decade. Elena felt rage building in her chest, like pressure in a steam boiler. The Whitmores had built their empire on the backs of honest, working families, using their control of the legal system to steal what they couldn't buy and silence anyone who dared to resist. Her Cherokee grandmother had told her stories about men like this, predators who used law and religion and social convention as weapons against those who couldn't fight back through traditional means. "Mr. Whitmore," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that made everyone in the forge pay attention, "let me make something perfectly clear. I would rather spend my life breaking rocks in a prison quarry than spend one day as your wife. Your money, your family's influence, your threats, none of that changes the fact that you're a weak man who can only get what he wants by taking it from people who can't fight back." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Marcus and Dylan looked shocked by Elena's direct confrontation with Nathaniel's authority. No one spoke to a Whitmore that way, especially not a blacksmith's daughter with Cherokee blood. Nathaniel's face flushed red above his white collar, but when he spoke, his voice was deadly calm. "Miss Morrison, I'm afraid you've just made a very serious mistake. In this county, people who show disrespect to their betters tend to face consequences that extend far beyond their own personal circumstances. He remounted his horse with jerky, angry movements, his cousins following suit with expressions that suggested they were already planning their revenge. "Mr. Morrison," Nathaniel called as they prepared to leave, "you might want to review your fire insurance policy. These old wooden buildings can be quite vulnerable, especially during the dry season." After the Whitmores rode away, Thomas Morrison slumped against the forge, as if his strength had suddenly deserted him. "Elena, what have you done? You've just declared war on the most powerful family in the county." Elena was still trembling with rage, but her voice was steady. "No, Papa. They declared war on us months ago. I just refused to surrender without a fight." But even as she spoke the defiant words, Elena couldn't shake the chill that had settled in her bones. She'd grown up hearing whispered stories about what happened to people who crossed the Whitmores. Mysterious accidents, false accusations, families who simply disappeared in the night. Judge Harrison Whitmore controlled the sheriff's department, the courts, and half the town council. If they wanted to destroy the Morrison family, they had the power to do it legally and completely. That evening, as Elena helped her father close the forge for the day, she noticed unusual activity around the town. Deputy Sheriff Blake Crawford, one of Judge Whitmore's most loyal enforcers, was making rounds to businesses that had never required law enforcement attention before. Men in expensive suits were examining buildings and taking notes. The message was clear. The Whitmores were mobilizing their network of influence to make good on their threats. "Maybe I should apologize," Elena said quietly as she and her father walked home to their small cabin behind the forge. "Maybe if I explained that I was just emotional." "No," Thomas said firmly, surprising her with his sudden resolve. "Your mother would roll over in her grave if she knew I let you grovel to men like that. She faced down worse than the Whitmores during the removal years, and she never bowed her head to anyone." Elena's mother, Sarah White Deer Morrison, had been one of the Cherokee who'd managed to avoid the Trail of Tears by hiding in the mountains and eventually marrying a white blacksmith who loved her enough to face the social consequences. She'd died when Elena was 12, but not before passing on stories of Cherokee resistance and the importance of standing up to those who used power to oppress the innocent. "What are we going to do, Papa?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the mountains where his wife's people had once lived freely. "We're going to do what your mother would have done. We're going to survive, and we're going to find a way to fight back. The Whitmores may control this town, but they don't control everything. There are still people in these mountains who remember what justice looks like." That night, Eleanor lay awake, listening to the sounds of the Tennessee wilderness beyond her. Window, the call of night birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the trees. Somewhere out there, in the hidden valleys and secret places her mother had told her about, lived people who'd never submitted to the Whitmore's authority. Cherokee families who'd survived removal, mountain folk who valued independence above, comfort former slaves who'd found freedom in the wilderness. She didn't know it yet, but help was already on its way. A message had been sent through channels the Whitmores didn't know existed, carrying word of injustice to someone who'd spent his life fighting the kind of corruption that poisoned Copper Ridge. Someone who understood that sometimes the law itself became the enemy of justice, and that protecting the innocent required courage that went beyond what any courtroom could provide. As dawn broke over the Cumberland Mountains, Elena Morrison prepared for what might be her last day of freedom. She didn't know that within 72 hours, her defiance of Nathaniel Whitmore would lead to circumstances more terrifying than anything she'd imagined. But she also didn't know that her mother's people had never forgotten the daughter of Sarah White Deer, and that help would come from the most unexpected direction, when her courage finally reached its limits. The forge fire burned bright that morning, but darker flames were already being kindled in the hearts of men who believed that power gave them the right to take whatever they desired, regardless of the cost to others. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 days after the confrontation, the first blow came at dawn on Wednesday morning when Sheriff Garrett Collins arrived at the Morrison Forge with an official-looking document bearing the seal of the Copper Ridge Town Council. Eleanor watched from the cabin window as her father read the notice, his shoulders sagging with each line of bureaucratic language designed to sound reasonable while being completely devastating. "Fire safety inspection failed," Thomas called out to Eleanor as she emerged from the cabin, still wearing her work dress from the previous day. "Building code violations, immediate cessation of all blacksmithing activities until compliance is achieved." Eleanor snatched the document from her father's hands, scanning the list of supposed violations. Inadequate ventilation, despite the fact that their forge had operated safely for 15 years. Improper storage of combustible materials, referring to the seasoned wood they used for fuel, stored exactly as every other blacksmith in Tennessee stored theirs. Structural deficiencies in the building foundation, a building that Thomas Morrison had constructed himself using methods passed down from his own father. "This is absurd," Elena said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Sheriff Collins, you've been in our forge dozens of times. You know there's nothing unsafe about our operation." Sheriff Collins wouldn't meet her eyes. Garrett Collins had been a decent man once, Elena remembered. He'd helped her father during the harsh winter of 1843, when a broken leg had prevented Thomas from working for 2 months. But that was before Judge Whitmore had gotten him elected sheriff with promises of steady pay and political backing. "Elena," Collins said uncomfortably, "I'm just enforcing the codes as they're written. If you want to dispute this, you'll need to appear before the town council at their next meeting." "When is that meeting?" Thomas asked, though Eleanor suspected they both already knew the answer would be designed to cause maximum hardship. 6 weeks from Friday," Collins replied. "You can submit an appeal in writing along with the $50 filing fee." $50? More money than the Morrison family saw in 3 months of regular business. Elena understood the calculation perfectly. By the time they could afford to file an appeal and wait for a hearing, they'd have lost all their customers to competing blacksmiths in neighboring towns. The Whitmores weren't just shutting down their business, they were ensuring it could never reopen. After Collins left, Eleanor and her father stood in the suddenly silent forge, surrounded by half-finished projects they could no longer complete legally. The Anderson family's wagon wheel repairs, the Hendersons' new gate hinges, the church's bell-mounting hardware, all of it now represented promises they couldn't keep and income they desperately needed. "We could borrow the filing fee," Eleanor suggested, though she knew it was hopeless. "Maybe Mr. Patterson at the bank." "Patterson's been trying to call in our existing loan for 6 months," Thomas interrupted gently. "He won't extend us credit for something like this. Besides, even if we could afford the appeal, Judge Whitmore sits on the town council. You think he's going to vote in our favor?" Elena slumped against the cold forge, feeling the weight of her decision to defy Nathaniel Whitmore settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her pride and principles had cost her family their livelihood, and she was beginning to understand that this was only the beginning of their troubles. The second blow came that afternoon when Eleanor walked to the general store to purchase supplies. With the last of their ready cash, Rebecca Stone, the store owner's wife, had always been friendly to Eleanor, often seeking her advice about her teenage daughter's rebellious behavior. But today, Rebecca's manner was distinctly cold. "I'm sorry, Elena," Rebecca said, when Elena approached the counter with a small basket of necessities. I can't extend credit to your family anymore. Store policy has changed. Elena set down the basket, confused. I wasn't asking for credit, Mrs. Stone. I have cash for these items. Rebecca's discomfort was visible as she glanced around the store, making sure no other customers were within earshot. Elena, I need you to understand something. Your father's a good man, and you're a fine girl, but, well, there are new regulations about who we can conduct business with. The town's licensing board has made it clear that merchants who deal with families under investigation for code violations could face their own compliance reviews. The meaning was crystal clear. The Whitmores were using their influence to ensure that the Morrison family couldn't buy basic necessities in their own town. It was economic warfare, disguised as bureaucratic procedure, designed to force submission through starvation and isolation. Elena left the general store empty-handed, her mind reeling from the swift efficiency of the Whitmore retaliation. In less than 72 hours, they'd been cut off from their livelihood, their credit, and now their access to basic supplies. She was beginning to understand how the Whitmores had accumulated so much property and influence. They didn't just defeat their enemies, they systematically destroyed them. Walking home through the town square, Elena noticed other changes that chilled her blood. Deputy Crawford was stationed near the church, ostensibly checking on public safety, but actually positioned to observe everyone who came and went from the Morrison property. Several men she didn't recognize were conducting what appeared to be surveys of local businesses, but their attention seemed focused on establishments that had previously employed Thomas Morrison's services. Dr. William Henderson emerged from his medical practice just as Elena passed by, and she seized the opportunity to test how far the Whitmore influence extended. Dr. Henderson had been a family friend for years, had delivered Elena when her mother struggled through a difficult birth, and had never failed to treat the Morrison family with respect and kindness. "Dr. Henderson," Elena called softly, approaching his buggy where he was loading medical supplies for his afternoon rounds. The doctor turned, and Eleanor saw something she'd never seen in his eyes before: fear. Not just concern or worry, but genuine terror of being seen talking to her in public. "Elena," he said quietly, glancing around to see who might be watching. "I heard about the troubles at the forge. I'm sorry. Dr. Henderson, if there's anything you can do to help, any influence you might have with the town council." The doctor's face grew pained. "Elena, I wish I could help, but you have to understand my position. I have a practice to maintain, patients who depend on me. If I'm seen as opposing the town's leadership—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Elena understood. Dr. Henderson's medical practice required the goodwill of influential families to survive. If he defended the Morrisons, the Whitmores could easily arrange for him to lose his most profitable patients, his hospital privileges, even his license to practice medicine in the county. "I understand, Dr. Henderson," Elena said quietly. "I wouldn't want to put you in a difficult position." As the doctor drove away, Elena felt the full weight of her family's isolation settling around her like a shroud. The Whitmores had systematically cut off every avenue of support, every potential ally, every means of economic survival. They weren't just punishing her for rejecting Nathaniel's advances, they were sending a message to the entire community about what happened to those who defied their authority. That evening, as Elena and her father sat in their cabin trying to calculate how long their remaining money would last, a soft knock came at the door. Thomas opened it cautiously to find Mrs. Elizabeth Carey, an elderly widow who lived on the outskirts of town. Elizabeth was one of the few people in Copperidge who remembered the area before the Whitmores' rise to power, and she'd never been intimidated by their influence. "Thomas, Eleanor," she said, stepping into the cabin and speaking in urgent whispers. I've come to warn you. There's talk in town, dangerous talk. Some of the men who work for Judge Whitmore have been asking questions about Elena's mother, about her Cherokee connections. Elena's blood ran cold. Her mother's Cherokee heritage was known in the community, but it had never been considered threatening before. In the post-removal years, most people preferred to ignore the presence of Cherokee families who'd managed to remain in Tennessee, treating them as an unfortunate reminder of an unpleasant period in local history. "What kind of questions?" Thomas asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Questions about tribal connections, about whether Sarah ever made contact with Cherokee who escaped removal, about whether Elena might have knowledge of Cherokee hiding places or resistance activities. Elizabeth's voice dropped even lower. "Thomas, they're building a case. If they can paint Elena as having connections to Cherokee insurgents, they can justify almost anything." This strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. In 1847 Tennessee, any suggestion of Cherokee resistance or insurgent activity could be used to justify harsh legal measures. The federal government and state authorities were still paranoid about Cherokee who'd evaded removal, and any connection to such groups could result in imprisonment, forced relocation, or worse. "But Elena has no connection to any Cherokee resistance," Thomas protested. "Sarah died years ago, and she never involved Elena in any political activities." "That won't matter if they decide to manufacture evidence," Elizabeth replied grimly. "Judge Whitmore has connections in the Federal Territorial Office. If he claims that Elena poses a security threat, he can have her arrested and held without trial while they investigate her alleged activities." Elena felt the walls closing in around her family. The Whitmores weren't content to destroy their economic livelihood. They were preparing to use Elena's Cherokee heritage as a weapon to justify much harsher punishment. In the paranoid atmosphere of post-removal Tennessee, accusations of Cherokee insurgency could result in imprisonment, exile, or even execution. "There's something else," Elizabeth continued. "I've heard rumors that Nathaniel plans to make another approach to you, Elena, a final offer before they take more serious action. Be very careful how you respond. I fear they're setting a trap." After Elizabeth left, Elena and her father sat in grim silence, contemplating the impossible situation they faced. If Elena continued to refuse Nathaniel's advances, her Cherokee heritage would be used to justify her destruction. But accepting his proposal would mean surrendering not just her own freedom, but legitimizing the Whitmores' use of economic terrorism against anyone who dared to resist their authority. "Papa," Elena said finally, "what would Mama have done?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph of his late wife that sat on their small mantelpiece. Sarah White Deer Morrison had faced impossible choices during the removal period, had seen friends and family destroyed by forces beyond their control, had watched entire communities disappear into exile or death. "Your mother would have fought," he said finally. "She would have found a way to resist that didn't involve surrendering her dignity or her principles. But Eleanor, she had advantages you don't have. She had tribal connections, people who could help when the law became the enemy. We're alone here." But even as Thomas spoke the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't as alone as they appeared. For the past few days, he'd noticed subtle signs that someone was watching their situation with interest, not the obvious surveillance of the Whitmore deputies, but something more careful and professional. A figure glimpsed in the forest beyond, their cabin, fresh tracks near their property that didn't belong to any local residents, the feeling of being observed by sympathetic rather than hostile eyes. Elena had noticed it too, though she hadn't mentioned it to her father. Her Cherokee grandmother had taught her to read the signs of the forest, to distinguish between natural and human presence, to sense when she was being watched by friend or foe. Someone was out there, someone who moved with the stealth and patience of a hunter, but who made no move to approach or threaten them. As night fell over Copper Ridge, Elena prepared for what she sensed would be a crucial day tomorrow. Nathaniel Whitmore would make his final offer, and her response would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the fate of her father and any other families who might dare to resist the Whitmore's expanding power. She didn't know that. Her defiance had already attracted attention from people who'd spent decades fighting exactly the kind of corruption that the Whitmores represented. In the hidden valleys of the Cumberland Mountains, messages were being passed through networks that the white authorities had never discovered, carrying word of injustice to those who still remembered what justice looked like. Help was coming, but it would arrive too late to prevent the next phase of Nathaniel Whitmore's campaign of revenge. Elena Morrison was about to learn that some traps are so carefully constructed that walking into them becomes unavoidable, and that the price of maintaining one's principles can be higher than anything she'd ever imagined. The forge fire had been extinguished by official order, but other fires were beginning to burn in the hearts of people who understood that sometimes the law itself becomes the enemy of justice. October 15th, 1847. 1 week after the business closure, the autumn rain drummed against the windows of the Morrison cabin like urgent fingers tapping out a warning. Eleanor sat at her mother's old spinning wheel, trying to earn a few coins by preparing wool for Mrs. Patterson, one of the few women in town brave enough to secretly employ her services. The repetitive motion of the wheel provided little comfort as she contemplated the impossible choice that awaited her. For 7 days, the Morrison family had survived on dwindling savings and the kindness of neighbors who risked their own standing by helping them. Elena had watched her father age years in a single week, the stress of their situation carving new lines around his eyes and stealing the strength from his shoulders. The proud blacksmith who'd once been sought after throughout 3 counties now sat idle, forbidden from practicing the only trade he'd ever known. A sharp knock at the door interrupted Elena's troubled thoughts. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see 3 figures on horseback. Nathaniel Whitmore, flanked by his cousins Marcus and Dylan, all wearing expensive rain slickers that marked them as men who never had to worry about staying dry or warm. Behind them, barely visible through the downpour, waited Deputy Sheriff Crawford and 2 other men Elena didn't recognize. "Elena," her father said quietly, rising from his chair by the fireplace, "perhaps you should—" "No, Papa," Elena interrupted, setting aside the spinning wheel with deliberate calm. "If Mr. Whitmore has something to say, he can say it to my face. I won't hide in my own home." Thomas Morrison opened the door, his weathered frame blocking the entrance as much as possible. "Mr. Whitmore," he said with careful politeness, "this isn't really a good time for social calls." Nathaniel pushed past Thomas without ceremony, water dripping from his expensive coat onto the modest wooden floor of the cabin. His pale eyes immediately found Elena, and she saw something in his expression that made her skin crawl. A mixture of desire and vindictive triumph that spoke of a man who'd been planning this moment carefully. "Miss Morrison," Nathaniel said with exaggerated courtesy, removing his hat with a flourish that mocked genuine respect. "I trust you've had time to reconsider our previous conversation in light of recent developments." Elena stood slowly, drawing herself up to her full height, despite the fact that Nathaniel towered over her. "I've reconsidered many things, Mr. Whitmore. Mostly, I've been reconsidering my previous assessment of your character. I believe I was too generous in my initial evaluation. Marcus and Dylan Whitmore exchanged glances that suggested this wasn't going according to their cousin's plan. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he maintained his facade of civilized discourse. "Elena," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made her want to reach for the poker by the fireplace, "I've come to make you an offer that I hope you'll consider more carefully than my previous proposals. My family has discussed your situation at length, and we've decided to be magnanimous despite your previous rudeness." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, opening it to reveal an official-looking document. "This is a marriage contract, Elena. Very generous terms, I think you'll agree. You would become my wife with all the social and financial advantages that entails. Your father would be appointed as the official blacksmith for all Whitmore properties, a position that would provide steady income and social standing." Elena glanced at her father, seeing the desperate hope that flickered in his eyes despite his attempts to hide it. The offer was indeed generous by conventional standards. Marriage to Nathaniel would solve all their immediate problems and provide security beyond anything they could achieve independently. "And what exactly would be expected of me as your wife?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Nathaniel's smile became predatory. "Complete loyalty, of course. Absolute obedience to my wishes and those of my family. Abandonment of any unseemly independence or defiance of proper authority. You would become a proper lady, Elena, with all the refinement and submission that position requires." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Elena understood that accepting Nathaniel's proposal wouldn't just mean surrendering her own freedom. It would mean legitimizing the Whitmores' belief that any woman could be broken through sufficient pressure, that resistance was ultimately futile when faced with superior power and resources. "I see," Elena said quietly. "And if I refuse this generous offer?" Nathaniel's mask of civility finally slipped, revealing the cruelty that had always lurked beneath his polished exterior. "If you refuse, then I'm afraid your family's troubles will escalate considerably. You see, Elena, we've uncovered some very interesting information about your mother's activities during the removal period." He gestured toward the men waiting outside, and Elena realized that the strangers with Deputy Crawford weren't local law enforcement. Their bearing and clothing suggested federal authorities, men with the power to enforce regulations that superseded local jurisdiction. "Agent Samuel Morrison," Nathaniel called, and one of the strangers dismounted and approached the cabin door. "Please share with Miss Morrison what your investigation has revealed about her mother's alleged activities." Agent Morrison was a thin man with cold eyes and the demeanor of someone who'd spent his career hunting people society preferred to forget. "Miss Morrison," he said formally, "we have evidence suggesting that your mother, Sarah White Dear Morrison, maintained contact with Cherokee insurgents who evaded federal removal orders. Specifically, we believe she provided material support to illegal Cherokee settlements in the Cumberland Mountains." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. The accusation was probably true. Her mother had indeed helped Cherokee families who'd hidden in the mountains rather than submit to forced relocation. But that assistance had consisted of food, medical supplies, and information about safe travel routes, not the insurgent activities that Agent Morrison's words implied. "Furthermore," the agent continued, "we have testimony suggesting that Miss Elena Morrison has knowledge of these illegal settlements and may have continued her mother's pattern of providing aid to Cherokee who are residing in Tennessee in violation of federal law." The trap was perfect in its construction. Whether Elena knew the location of hidden Cherokee settlements or not, the mere accusation gave federal authorities justification to arrest her for questioning. And once she was in federal custody, the normal legal protections that might have shielded her from local corruption would no longer apply. "This is ridiculous," Thomas Morrison said, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "Elena was a child when her mother died. She has no knowledge of any Cherokee settlements, legal or otherwise." Agent Morrison's expression didn't change. "Nevertheless, federal law requires that we investigate any potential security threats posed by individuals with known connections to Cherokee insurgents. Miss Morrison will need to come with us for questioning." Elena understood the calculation now. Nathaniel had orchestrated this confrontation to give her an impossible choice: marriage to him or arrest on federal charges that could result in imprisonment, forced relocation, or worse. The federal authorities provided legitimacy for what was essentially extortion disguised as law enforcement. "However," Nathaniel said smoothly, "Agent Morrison has agreed to suspend his investigation pending resolution of certain local matters. If Miss Morrison were to accept my marriage proposal and demonstrate her complete loyalty to established authority, the federal government might conclude that she poses no security threat." The offer was clear: submit to marriage and sexual slavery, or face arrest on charges that could destroy her life even if she was eventually cleared. Elena looked at her father's stricken face, at the federal agents waiting to arrest her, at Nathaniel's triumphant expression as he savored what he clearly believed was his inevitable victory. "Mr. Whitmore," Elena said finally, her voice steady, despite the chaos in her mind, "may I have a moment to consider your offer privately with my father?" Nathaniel nodded graciously, clearly confident that the weight of federal authority had finally broken her resistance. "Of course. Take all the time you need, though I should mention that Agent Morrison's patience has limits." After the men stepped outside to wait under the cabin's small porch, Elena and her father stood facing each other in the suddenly quiet room. Thomas Morrison's face showed the full weight of their impossible situation: love for his daughter warring with terror at the consequences of continued resistance. "Elena," he said quietly, "maybe this is the best we can hope for. Nathaniel is offering security, protection from these federal charges. If I married him, Elena interrupted, I would spend the rest of my life as the property of a man who enjoys breaking people for his own pleasure. Papa, you know what kind of man he is. You've seen how he treats people who can't fight back." Thomas was quiet for a moment, staring at the rain running down their small window. "Your mother faced choices like this during the removal years. Impossible choices where every option led to suffering. What did she choose? She chose to fight, even when fighting seemed hopeless. She chose to preserve her dignity, even when submission would have been safer." Thomas met his daughter's eyes. "But Elena, she had options you don't have. She had tribal connections, people who could help when the law became the enemy. We're alone here." Elena walked to the window, watching the federal agents through the rain-distorted glass. Agent Morrison was examining some kind of document, while Deputy Crawford pointed toward the mountains beyond the town. They were planning something beyond simple arrest, probably a search of Cherokee hiding places that would justify broader persecution of anyone with tribal connections. "Papa," she said quietly, "do you remember the stories Mama told about the hidden places in the mountains, the valleys where her people found refuge during the worst times?" Thomas nodded slowly. "She said there were places where the Cherokee spirit lived on, where people still followed the old ways despite everything the government had done to destroy them." "What if we're not as alone as we think?" Elena asked, turning back to face her father. "What if Mama's people remember the daughter of Sarah White Deer? What if there are still those who honor the obligations of kinship and justice?" Before Thomas could respond, Nathaniel's voice called from outside. "Miss Morrison, I'm afraid Agent Morrison is growing impatient. We'll need your decision now." Elena looked at her father one last time, seeing in his weathered face the love that had sustained her through 18 years of growth and learning. She thought of her mother's stories about Cherokee resistance, about the importance of preserving one's spirit even when the body was threatened, about the obligation to stand against injustice regardless of personal cost. "Mr. Whitmore," she called through the door, "you may tell Agent Morrison that I'm ready to give my answer." She opened the door and stepped onto the porch, facing the assembled men with her chin raised and her shoulders straight. In the distance, barely visible through the rain, she could see other figures watching from the tree line, neighbors who lacked the courage to intervene but couldn't resist witnessing what might be the final confrontation between the Morrison family and the Whitmore power structure. "Mr. Whitmore," Elena said clearly, her voice carrying across the muddy yard, "I want to thank you for your generous offer of marriage. It's given me the opportunity to understand exactly what kind of man you are and what kind of life you're proposing." Nathaniel's smile began to fade as he sensed that her response wasn't going to be the submission he'd anticipated. "You're offering me the chance to become your property in exchange for protection from charges you've manufactured through corruption and intimidation. You're asking me to legitimize your belief that any woman can be broken if you apply enough pressure to her family and community." Elena stepped forward, rain beginning to soak through her simple dress. "My answer, Mr. Whitmore, is that I would rather face whatever punishment you and your government friends can devise than spend one day pretending to love a man who represents everything that's wrong with the world." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Agent Morrison looked surprised by Elena's direct rejection of what most people would have considered their only hope for survival. Nathaniel's face flushed red with humiliation and rage. "Very well, Miss Morrison. Agent Morrison, please proceed with the arrest." But as the federal agent stepped forward, a new sound cut through the rain, the distinctive whistle of a Cherokee hunting call, barely audible but unmistakable to anyone who knew its meaning. Elena's heart leaped as she recognized the signal her mother had taught her years ago, a call that meant help was approaching for those who needed it most. Agent Morrison hesitated, his hand on his weapon as he tried to locate the source of the sound. In that moment of confusion, Elena understood that her mother's people had indeed been watching, waiting, preparing to act when justice demanded it. The confrontation was far from over, but for the first time in days, Elena Morrison felt hope, stirring in her chest like a small flame in the darkness. October 15th, 1847, evening. The iron manacles clicked shut around Elena's wrists with a sound that seemed to echo through her very soul. Agent Morrison's grip was firm, but not cruel, as he secured the restraints. He was simply a man doing what he considered his duty, blind to the web of corruption that had maneuvered him into becoming an instrument of the Whitmores' revenge. "Miss Morrison," Agent Morrison said formally, "you're under arrest for suspected conspiracy to aid Cherokee insurgents in violation of federal territorial law. You'll be held pending investigation." Elena lifted her chin, refusing to show the terror that clawed at her insides. Around her, the assembled men watched with varying degrees of satisfaction and discomfort. Nathaniel's face glowed with vindictive triumph, while Deputy Crawford seemed troubled by the direction events had taken. Her father stood frozen in the cabin doorway, his face a mask of helpless anguish. "Agent Morrison," Thomas Morrison said desperately, "surely this can wait until morning. My daughter isn't going anywhere, and traveling in this storm. Federal security matters don't wait for convenient weather," Nathaniel interrupted smoothly. "Besides, we have appropriate facilities for housing Miss Morrison while the investigation proceeds." Elena's blood chilled at the implication. They weren't taking her to the county jail, where she might have contact with sympathetic locals or legal representation. Nathaniel was planning something more isolated, more controllable, As Agent Morrison led her toward the waiting horses, Elena caught sight of movement in the tree line beyond their property. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure, tall, wearing dark clothing that blended with the forest shadows, but when she looked again, there was nothing but rain and darkness. The Cherokee hunting call came again, softer this time but unmistakably closer. Agent Morrison heard it too, his head turning sharply toward the sound. "What was that?" he demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Probably just a bird," Deputy Crawford said nervously. "These mountains are full of strange sounds, especially during storms." But Elena knew better. Her mother's people were out there watching, waiting for the right moment to act. The knowledge gave her strength as she was lifted onto a horse behind one of Agent Morrison's men, her bound hands making it impossible to maintain her balance without assistance. The ride through Copper Ridge toward the Whitmore estate was a nightmare of cold rain and uncomfortable positioning. Elena's wet dress clung to her skin, and the iron manacles chafed against her wrists with every movement of the horse. Worse than the physical discomfort was the humiliation of being paraded through town like a criminal, past neighbors who watched from behind curtained windows but dared not intervene. The Whitmore mansion loomed out of the darkness like something from a Gothic novel, its imposing facade made even more forbidding by the storm. Warm light glowed from several windows, suggesting a household prepared for guests or prisoners. Elena realized with growing dread that her arrest had been planned in advance, that facilities for her confinement had already been prepared. Judge Harrison Whitmore himself awaited them on the covered porch, a distinguished figure in evening dress who radiated the kind of authority that came from decades of wielding unchallenged power. At 62, the judge was still imposing, tall, silver-haired, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything in terms of its usefulness to his interests. "Agent Morrison," Judge Whitmore said with the warmth of a host greeting, "expected guests, I trust your journey went smoothly despite the weather. Miss Morrison appears to have survived the trip in good condition." Eleanor dismounted with as much dignity as she could manage, while shackled, her legs trembling from cold and exhaustion. The judge studied her with the calculating gaze of a man, assessing valuable property, and she understood that Nathaniel had inherited more than just his looks from his father. "Your Honor," Agent Morrison said formally, "the prisoner is ready for initial questioning whenever you're prepared to proceed." "Excellent. I've prepared appropriate facilities in the cellar, secure, private, suitable for extended interrogation, if necessary." Judge Whitmore's smile was perfectly cordial, but Eleanor caught the underlying menace in his words. As they approached the mansion's entrance, Eleanor noticed additional details that suggested this evening had been carefully orchestrated. Extra servants were visible through the windows, men who looked more like guards than household staff. Several expensive carriages stood in the circular drive, indicating that other important figures were present to witness her humiliation. The interior of the Whitmore mansion was even more impressive than Elena had imagined. Crystal chandeliers, imported furnishings, artwork that probably cost more than most families earned in a lifetime. But tonight, all that luxury felt oppressive, a display of power designed to emphasize her helplessness. "Miss Morrison," Judge Whitmore said as they paused in the grand foyer, "before we proceed with formal questioning, I wanted to offer you one final opportunity to reconsider your position. My son's marriage proposal remains open, despite your previous discourtesy." Elena met the judge's eyes directly, seeing in them the same cold calculation she'd observed in Nathaniel. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I would rather spend my life in prison than one day married to your son." Judge Whitmore's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that suggested her defiance had sealed her fate. "Very well. Agent Morrison, please escort Miss Morrison to her quarters. I believe extended reflection might help clarify her thinking." The descent into the Whitmore cellar was like descending into hell itself. The wooden stairs creaked ominously under their weight, and the air grew progressively colder and damper with each step. Agent Morrison carried a lantern that cast dancing shadows on stone walls that wept with moisture, creating an atmosphere of medieval dungeons rather than a modern home storage area. The cellar had been divided into several rooms, and Eleanor realized with horror that this wasn't the first time the Whitmores had used their basement for imprisonment. The walls showed signs of previous modifications: iron rings set into the stone, scratches that might have been made by desperate fingernails, stains that Elena preferred not to identify. "This is highly irregular," Agent Morrison muttered as they reached the prepared cell. "Federal prisoners should be held in proper facilities, not private residences. Judge Whitmore has federal authority for territorial security matters." "Deputy," Crawford replied, though his voice carried doubt. "Besides, this is temporary until transport can be arranged to the regional facility." The cell itself was a nightmare of careful preparation. Iron shackles had been attached to the wall at precisely the right height to keep a prisoner standing but not comfortable. A wooden bucket in the corner served as the only sanitary facility. A thin mattress on the stone floor provided the sole concession to human comfort, but it was the other details that truly terrified Elena. Scratch marks on the walls spelled out partial names and desperate messages. Mary Henderson, 1845, was carved into one stone. "God help me" appeared multiple times in different handwriting. This wasn't just a temporary holding cell. It was a place where people had been held for extended periods, their spirits systematically broken through isolation and despair. Agent Morrison secured Elena's shackles to the wall rings with obvious reluctance. "Miss Morrison," he said quietly, "I want you to understand that cooperation will make this easier for everyone. The federal government isn't interested in persecuting innocent people, but we must investigate potential security threats." Elena looked at this man who seemed genuinely to believe he was serving justice. "Agent Morrison, do you really think I pose a security threat to the United States government? Do I look like an insurgent leader to you?" Morrison's hesitation was visible in the lantern light. "Miss Morrison, I follow evidence where it leads. Judge Whitmore has provided documentation of your mother's activities, testimony from reliable sources about your potential knowledge of Cherokee hiding places." "And who provided this documentation and testimony?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. Morrison was quiet for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of her questions. "Local sources with knowledge of Cherokee activities in the region. Local sources who happen to have financial interests in silencing my family's opposition to certain business practices." Agent Morrison's expression suggested that Eleanor's words had struck closer to the truth than he wanted to admit. But before he could respond, footsteps on the cellar stairs announced the arrival of additional visitors. Judge Whitmore descended into the cellar, accompanied by Nathaniel and two other men Eleanor didn't recognize, well-dressed individuals who carried themselves with the authority of people accustomed to power. Behind them came a woman Elena had seen at a distance, but never met, Victoria Whitmore, the judge's wife, whose reputation for cruelty toward servants and social inferiors was legendary throughout the county. "Agent Morrison," Judge Whitmore said formally, "these gentlemen are territorial representatives who've come to observe our interrogation procedures. Mr. Patterson from the Banking Authority and Mr. Wells from the Land Development Office." Elena understood immediately. The Whitmores weren't just punishing her for refusing Nathaniel's advances. They were using her case to demonstrate their power to other territorial officials, showing what happened to anyone who interfered with their business interests. "Miss Morrison," Judge Whitmore continued, "I'm going to ask you a series of questions about your knowledge of Cherokee settlements in the Cumberland Mountains. Your cooperation will determine how comfortable your stay here becomes. "I've already told Agent Morrison that I have no knowledge of any Cherokee settlements, legal or otherwise," Elena replied, though she knew her answer was irrelevant to their actual purposes. Victoria Whitmore stepped forward, her face twisted with malicious satisfaction. "Perhaps you need time to search your memory more carefully, dear. Extended solitude has a wonderful way of helping people remember things they thought they'd forgotten." The older woman's voice carried a cruelty that made Elena's skin crawl. Victoria Whitmore clearly enjoyed watching people suffer, and Elena realized that her imprisonment was going to be as much about satisfying the woman's sadistic impulses as about breaking her resistance. "Mrs. Whitmore," Agent Morrison said uncomfortably, "federal regulations require that prisoners be treated humanely during questioning." "Of course," Victoria replied smoothly. "We're simply providing Miss Morrison with a quiet environment for reflection. No one is suggesting anything improper," but the gleam in Victoria's eyes suggested that her definition of proper treatment would stretch federal regulations to their breaking point. As the group prepared to leave Elena alone in her cell, Nathaniel stepped closer to the wall where she was chained. "Eleanor," he said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of desire and vindictive pleasure, "you could end this at any time. One word from you, one agreement to accept my proposal, and you'd be released immediately." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "Nathaniel, I've told you before, I would rather die than marry you. Nothing about my current circumstances changes that." Nathaniel's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "We'll see how long your pride lasts down here. My mother has some very creative ideas about encouraging cooperation from stubborn guests." As the lantern light retreated up the cellar stairs, Elena was left alone in darkness, so complete it seemed to have physical weight. The silence was broken only by the steady drip of water from the stone ceiling and the distant sound of storm wind above ground. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Elena noticed something that gave her a spark of hope. One of the stones in the far wall looked different from the others, slightly displaced, as if it had been moved recently, and carved into the stone beside it, barely visible in the faint light that filtered down from above, were symbols that made her heart race. With recognition, Cherokee marks, recent ones. Someone had been here recently, someone who knew the old writing, someone who'd left a message for those who could read it. Elena strained to make out the symbols in the darkness, her mother's teachings coming back to her after years of disuse. "Help comes," was the message carved into the stone. "Be ready." Her mother's people hadn't forgotten Sarah Whitedeer's daughter. Even in the depths of the Whitmore dungeon, Elena Morrison was not alone. October 16th, 1847, dawn in the Cumberland Mountains. 40 miles northeast of Copper Ridge, in a hidden valley that appeared on no territorial maps, Joseph Standing Bear emerged from his morning prayers as the first light of dawn touched the peaks of the Cumberland Mountains. At 38, he moved with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life in harmony with the wilderness, his presence commanding respect from both the natural world and the 73 Cherokee who'd found refuge under his protection. Standing Bear wasn't a chief in the traditional sense. The old tribal structures had been shattered by removal and exile. But in the desperate years since the Trail of Tears, he'd become something perhaps more important. A guardian of Cherokee people who'd refused to surrender their homeland, a protector of families who'd chosen death over exile, a symbol of resistance that the federal government had never managed to destroy. The message had reached him 3 days earlier through the network of hidden trails and trusted contacts that connected scattered Cherokee communities throughout the Tennessee mountains. A young woman named Elena Morrison, daughter of Sarah Whitedeer, was in danger from the white authorities who'd grown bold in their persecution of anyone with Cherokee blood. Standing Bear remembered Sarah Whitedeer Morrison. She'd been barely 16 when she'd helped his family escape the soldiers who came to enforce the removal order. Her courage had saved 12 lives that terrible winter of 1838, including Standing Bear's own sister and her infant daughter. The debt of honor was clear and undeniable. Cherokee law demanded that he protect Sarah's daughter just as Sarah had protected his family. But the information his scouts had brought during the night changed everything. Elena Morrison hadn't just been arrested. She'd been taken to the private dungeon of Judge Harrison Whitmore, the man whose corrupt authority had made life hell for Cherokee and white families alike throughout East Tennessee. Standing Bear knew Judge Whitmore by reputation and bitter experience. It was Whitmore who'd issued the legal orders that stripped Cherokee families of their property rights. Whitmore who'd authorized bounty hunters to track escaped Cherokee through the mountains. Whitmore who'd used his federal connections to make the persecution of native families both legal and profitable. Little Hawk, Standing Bear called to a young Cherokee scout who'd just returned from reconnaissance near Copper Ridge. "Tell me exactly what you observed at the White Chief's stone." Lodge. Little Hawk was 19. Born in the mountains after removal, raised in the traditional ways by grandparents who'd refused to let Cherokee culture die. His English was perfect when necessary, but in the hidden valley, he spoke only Cherokee, maintaining the language that federal authorities had tried so hard to erase. "The girl is held in the stone pit beneath the great house," Little Hawk reported. "I counted 6 guards on the grounds, 2 at the main entrance. More inside. The white soldiers who brought her left before dawn, but the evil ones remain." Standing Bear absorbed this information with the patience of a hunter planning a crucial strike. The Whitmore mansion was heavily defended, built like a fortress to protect the judge's wealth and power. A direct assault would be suicide for his small band of Cherokee, no matter how skilled they were in mountain warfare. "What of her family?" Standing Bear asked. "The blacksmith father remains in his cabin, watched but not imprisoned. The townspeople are afraid. They know the White Chief's power and dare not speak against his actions." Standing Bear nodded grimly. Thomas Morrison was Sarah White Deer's husband, which made him kin by Cherokee law regardless of his white blood. But Thomas was being left free deliberately, bait to draw any rescue attempt into a trap that would justify even harsher persecution of Cherokee families throughout the region. "Grey Wolf," Standing Bear called to an older Cherokee warrior who'd fought in the removal wars. "What do you know of this stone lodge's defenses?" Grey Wolf had survived the worst years of Cherokee persecution through a combination of cunning, courage, and detailed knowledge of white settlements throughout the territory. At 55, he was one of the few Cherokee still alive who remembered the valley before removal, who'd seen the systematic destruction of Cherokee civilization with his own eyes. "I scouted that place many seasons ago," Grey Wolf replied. "The White Chief built it like a war lodge, with stone walls and iron barriers. But the earth beneath is different. Old Cherokee caves that connect to the river system. The white builders knew nothing of the deep places when they set their foundation." Standing Bear felt a spark of hope. Cherokee knowledge of the underground. Cave systems had been passed down through generations of families who'd used them for ceremony, storage, and refuge during times of conflict. If the Whitmore mansion had been built over one of these ancient networks, there might be ways to reach Elena that her captors had never considered. "Can the caves be used for rescue?" Standing Bear asked. Grey Wolf was quiet for a moment, consulting memories that went back decades. "Dangerous but possible. The water level changes with the seasons. Now it runs low enough for passage, but the caves are narrow, treacherous in darkness. One mistake would mean death for both rescuer and captive." Standing Bear understood the risks, but Cherokee law was clear about obligations to family and tribe. Sarah White Deer had risked her life to save Cherokee families during the removal. Her daughter's courage in standing against white authority honored her mother's memory and deserved protection, regardless of personal cost. "Gather the council," Standing Bear ordered. "We have a decision to make." Within an hour, the 12 eldest, Cherokee in the Hidden Valley, had assembled in the ceremonial lodge that served as the community's spiritual and political center. The structure was built in the traditional manner, with a central fire and seating arranged according to ancient protocols that connected them to Cherokee ancestors who'd governed through consensus for thousands of years. Standing Bear presented the situation with the formal language appropriate to matters of tribal importance. Elena Morrison's imprisonment represented more than just individual injustice. It was part of the ongoing war against Cherokee survival, an attempt to use white law as a weapon against anyone who carried Cherokee blood or honored Cherokee values. "The white chief grows bold," observed Singing Crow, an elderly woman whose authority as a keeper of Cherokee traditions made her voice carry special weight in council decisions. "He believes we are broken, that we no longer protect our own. If we allow Sarah White Deer's daughter to suffer without response, we dishonor our ancestors and encourage further attacks on our people." Other council members voiced similar concerns. The Cherokee who'd survived removal had done so by maintaining their connections to each other, by honoring the obligations of kinship and mutual protection that white authorities tried to destroy. Abandoning Elena Morrison would represent a fundamental betrayal of the values that kept Cherokee culture alive, but Grey Wolf raised practical concerns that couldn't be ignored. "A rescue attempt will bring soldiers to the mountains. They will hunt us as never before, burn out families who've lived in peace for years. Are we prepared for that war?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the sacred fire. Every Cherokee in the valley had lost family members to white violence, had seen communities destroyed by military expeditions that claimed to be maintaining order. Any action that brought federal attention would endanger not just the rescue party, but every Cherokee family hidden throughout the Cumberland Mountains. Standing Bear listened to the debate with the patience of a leader who understood that tribal decisions required consensus, not autocratic command. But as the discussion continued, he found his thoughts turning to the young woman chained in Judge Whitmore's dungeon, facing the same choice between submission and death that had confronted Cherokee people for decades. "Brothers and sisters," Standing Bear said finally, "let me tell you what I believe. The white authorities want us to live in fear, to abandon each other when danger comes, to forget the obligations that make us Cherokee. If we rescue Sarah White Deer's daughter, we risk bringing war to our hidden valley. But if we abandon her, we become something less than Cherokee. We become people who've forgotten what it means to protect our own." The council debated for another hour, but Standing Bear could see that consensus was building around the necessity of action. Cherokee law was clear about obligations to family members, and Elena Morrison's courage in standing against corruption honored the best traditions of Cherokee resistance. When the vote came, it was unanimous. The hidden Cherokee would risk everything to rescue Sarah White Deer's daughter, not just because duty demanded it, but because allowing white corruption to triumph would represent a spiritual death worse than any physical destruction they might face. Standing Bear spent the rest of the day planning the rescue operation with the careful attention to detail that had kept his community alive through 9 years of hiding from federal authorities. The mission would require skills that went beyond simple warfare. Cave diving, silent infiltration, precise timing, and the kind of mountain craft that white soldiers could never match. He selected 4 Cherokee to accompany him on the rescue. Little Hawk for his speed and knowledge of the terrain around Copper Ridge. Grey Wolf for his understanding of the cave systems and white military tactics. Running Deer for her skill in healing and her ability to move silently through any environment. And Thundercloud, a Cherokee warrior whose strength and courage were legendary even among people who'd survived the worst persecution in tribal history. As sunset approached, Standing Bear performed the traditional ceremony that Cherokee warriors had observed before dangerous missions since time immemorial. He painted his face with the symbols that connected him to his ancestors, offered prayers to the spirits that protected Cherokee people, and asked for the strength to bring honor to his family and tribe through his actions. But even as he prepared for the rescue, Standing Bear understood that success would bring consequences that extended far beyond Elena Morrison's fate. Judge Whitmore wielded power that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. A successful rescue of his prisoner would trigger a manhunt that could destroy every Cherokee community in the Cumberland Mountains. The decision had been made, though. Cherokee law demanded protection for Sarah White Deer's daughter, regardless of personal cost. Standing Bear would honor that obligation or die in the attempt. As darkness fell over the hidden valley, 5 Cherokee warriors began their journey toward Copper Ridge, carrying weapons that had been blessed by tribal elders and hearts that burned with determination to prove that Cherokee resistance was far from broken. Elena Morrison had refused to surrender to corruption and injustice. Now it was time for her mother's people to show the same courage, to demonstrate that some bonds couldn't be broken by federal law or white authority. The hunt for justice was about to begin. October 17th, 1847, second day of imprisonment. Elena's second dawn in the Whitmore dungeon arrived not with sunlight but with the sound of heavy footsteps on the cellar stairs. Her body ached from spending the night chained to the stone wall, her wrists raw from the iron shackles, and her throat parched from the meager water ration she'd been given the previous evening. But her spirit remained unbroken, sustained by the Cherokee message carved into the stone and the knowledge that somewhere in the mountains, help was being prepared. Victoria Whitmore descended into the cellar like a predator approaching wounded prey, her expensive silk dress incongruous in the damp stone chamber. Behind her came 2 servants carrying trays of food, whose aromas were clearly designed to torment a prisoner who'd been given nothing but stale bread and brackish water since her arrival. "Good morning, dear," Victoria said with false sweetness, settling onto a wooden chair that had obviously been placed in the cellar specifically for these visits. "I trust you spent the night reflecting on your situation and perhaps reconsidering some of your previous decisions." Elena straightened as much as her restraints allowed, meeting Victoria's gaze with steady defiance. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've reflected quite thoroughly, and my position remains unchanged. Your son's marriage proposal is unacceptable, and I have no information about Cherokee settlements to share with your federal friends." Victoria's smile never wavered, but her eyes grew colder. "How interesting. You know, Elena, may I call you Elena? I've had considerable experience helping stubborn young women understand their proper place in the world. My methods are quite effective, though some people find them unpleasant." One of the servants set a tray on a small table near Eleanor's. Position: fresh bread, bacon, eggs, prepared exactly as Elena liked them, coffee that smelled like heaven after 36 hours of deprivation. The psychological torture was expertly designed. Offer what the prisoner desperately needed, then withdraw it to emphasize her helplessness. "You see, dear," Victoria continued conversationally, "the human body has such interesting responses to prolonged discomfort. First comes the physical pain, the aching joints, the chafed skin, the growing weakness from inadequate nutrition, but that's just the beginning." Elena said nothing, though her stomach cramped painfully at the sight and smell of real food. She understood that showing weakness would only encourage Victoria's sadistic games. "Then comes the emotional strain," Victoria went on, clearly enjoying her captive audience. "The isolation, the uncertainty about when suffering might end, the gradual erosion of hope. I found that even the strongest spirits can be adjusted, given sufficient motivation. Elena's thoughts turned to her mother's stories about Cherokee endurance during the removal years, about families who'd survived impossible hardships through spiritual strength and connection to their cultural identity. Sarah White Deer had taught her daughter that the body could be imprisoned, but the spirit remained free as long as one refused to surrender their essential self. "Mrs. Whitmore," Elena said quietly, "my mother survived things that would break most people. She taught me that dignity isn't something others can take away. It's something you choose to maintain, regardless of circumstances." Victoria's facade of pleasant conversation finally cracked, revealing the vicious temperament that lay beneath her cultivated exterior. "Your mother was a savage who seduced a decent white man and corrupted him with her heathen ways. Don't presume to lecture me about dignity when you're chained in my cellar like the animal you are." The racial slur hung in the air like a physical blow. Elena felt rage building in her chest, but she also recognized Victoria's strategy: provoke an emotional response that would justify harsher treatment, break down the prisoner's self-control through calculated humiliation. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Whitmore," Elena said with deliberate calm. "My mother was Cherokee, and I'm proud of that heritage. Cherokee women were respected for their strength, their wisdom, their ability to endure hardship without losing their humanity. Thank you for reminding me of the example I should follow." Victoria's face flushed red with frustrated anger. She'd clearly expected Elena to respond with tears, pleas, or defensive protests that would have provided openings for further psychological attack. Elena's composed acknowledgement of her Cherokee identity while maintaining her dignity seemed to infuriate Victoria more than any defiant outburst could have. "We'll see how long your savage pride lasts," Victoria hissed, rising from her chair with violent abruptness. "I have methods for dealing with stubborn animals that your precious mother never prepared you for." After Victoria left, Elena was alone, again with her thoughts and the growing physical discomfort of her situation. But as the morning progressed, she began to notice subtle changes in the household activity above her prison. Voices carried down through the stone ceiling, more people than usual, moving with what sounded like urgent purpose. Around midday, the cellar door opened again to admit Judge Whitmore himself, accompanied by Agent Morrison and two new federal officials whose bearing suggested higher authority than the local territorial representatives Elena had met previously. The judge carried himself with the satisfaction of a man whose plans were proceeding exactly as intended. "Miss Morrison," Judge Whitmore said formally, "I'd like you to meet Colonel James Davidson from the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs and Major Robert Sterling from the Territorial Security Division. They've traveled from Washington specifically to investigate your case." Elena's heart sank as she recognized the implications. The Whitmores had somehow managed to escalate her situation to the federal level, bringing in authorities whose power extended far beyond anything local corruption could influence. These weren't territorial officials who might be susceptible to pressure or appeals to justice. These were federal representatives with the authority to make her disappear permanently. Colonel Davidson was a stern man in his 50s, whose military bearing spoke of someone accustomed to absolute authority. His pale blue eyes studied Elena with the clinical interest of someone evaluating a potential threat to national security. "Miss Morrison," Davidson said formally, "we've received reports suggesting that you possess information about Cherokee insurgent activities that could threaten federal authority in this region. Your cooperation in providing this information would be viewed favorably by the federal government." Elena understood the offer being made. Provide information about Cherokee hiding places, whether real or fabricated, and receive favorable treatment. from federal authorities, refuse and face the full weight of federal persecution as an enemy of the state. Colonel Davidson, Eleanor replied carefully, I've already told Agent Morrison that I have no knowledge of any Cherokee insurgent activities. My mother died when I was 12, and I've had no contact with Cherokee communities since her death. Major, Sterling stepped forward, consulting a leather portfolio filled with official-looking documents. Miss Morrison, we have testimony suggesting otherwise. Multiple sources indicate that you've maintained contact with Cherokee who evaded federal removal orders, that you provided material support to illegal Cherokee settlements. Elena felt a chill of recognition. The Whitmores had manufactured evidence to support their accusations, creating a paper trail that would justify federal action regardless of the truth. She was being framed not just for refusing Nathaniel's marriage proposal, but as a genuine threat to federal authority. What sources? Elena asked, though she already suspected the answer. Reliable local authorities with knowledge of Cherokee activities in this region, Sterling replied smoothly. Individuals whose patriotism and commitment to federal law cannot be questioned. Elena almost laughed at the irony. The Whitmores, who'd built their empire through corruption and intimidation, were presenting themselves as patriotic citizens protecting federal authority from Cherokee insurgents. The accusation was so absurd, it would have been funny if not, for the deadly, serious consequences she faced. Gentlemen, Elena said, drawing on every ounce of strength her mother had taught her, you're asking me to confess to crimes I haven't committed and provide information I don't possess. I cannot and will not do either of those things, regardless of what punishment you threaten. Judge Whitmore's expression showed satisfaction rather than surprise at Elena's continued resistance. Colonel Davidson, as you can see, Miss Morrison, remains uncooperative despite reasonable attempts to secure her assistance. Perhaps more intensive interrogation methods are warranted. Elena's blood chilled at the implications. Intensive interrogation in 1847 often meant torture justified as necessary for national security. The federal government had broad authority to use whatever methods they deemed necessary to extract information from suspected threats to territorial stability. But before Colonel Davidson could respond, a new sound echoed through the cellar. A distant rumbling that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The federal officials looked around nervously, clearly unfamiliar with the mountain sounds that Elena had grown up hearing. Probably just settling in the foundation, Judge, Whitmore said dismissively. These old mountain houses make all sorts of noises. But Elena knew better. The sound was too rhythmic, too purposeful to be natural settling. Someone was moving through the cave systems beneath the mansion, getting closer to her prison. Her mother's people were coming, just as the Cherokee message had promised. Colonel Davidson, Elena said, her voice carrying new strength despite her physical weakness. Before you proceed with your intensive interrogation, you might want to consider whether your methods will produce reliable information or simply the answers you want to hear. Davidson's expression suggested he was indeed considering the effectiveness of coercion versus voluntary cooperation. But Judge Whitmore was clearly growing impatient with the federal official's deliberative approach. Gentlemen, the judge said firmly, Miss Morrison has had ample opportunity to cooperate voluntarily. I suggest we proceed with whatever methods are necessary to extract the information we need. Federal security cannot wait for this girl's convenience. The rumbling sound came again, closer this time, and clearly audible to everyone in the cellar. Agent Morrison frowned, his law enforcement training making him more sensitive to unusual sounds than the other officials. Judge Whitmore, Morrison said carefully, perhaps we should investigate that noise before proceeding. It could indicate structural problems that might affect the security of our prisoner. Eleanor fought to keep her expression neutral, but inside her heart was racing with hope. The Cherokee rescue was approaching, and the federal officials' presence might actually work in her favor by creating confusion and divided authority when the moment of action arrived. As the group debated how to proceed, Elena silently offered prayers to the Cherokee spirits her mother had taught her to honor, asking for strength to endure whatever came next and for protection for the brave people who were risking everything to save her. The breaking point was approaching, not just for Elena's endurance, but for the entire web of corruption and injustice that the Whitmores had woven around Copper Ridge. The darkness was deepest just before dawn, her mother had always said, and Elena could feel the approach of something that would change everything, forever. October 17th, 1847, late afternoon. 2 miles beneath the Whitmore mansion, Joseph Standing Bear pressed his body against the cold limestone wall of an ancient Cherokee ceremonial cave, listening to the sounds that echoed through the underground, passages like the whispers of ancestors. For 12 hours, he and his rescue party had been navigating the treacherous cave system that Grey Wolf remembered from his youth, following paths that had been used by Cherokee families for generations before white settlement had driven them into hiding. The journey through the underground labyrinth had tested every skill that Standing Bear possessed. The caves were partially flooded from recent rains, forcing the rescue party to swim through passages barely wide enough for a human body. Sharp limestone formations threatened to tear skin and clothing, while unstable rockfalls could trap or kill unwary travelers. Most dangerous of all were the sections where poisonous gases had accumulated, requiring the Cherokee to hold their breath for minutes at a time while navigating in complete darkness. "The stone lodge is directly above us now," Grey Wolf whispered in Cherokee, his voice barely audible over the sound of underground water. "But the passage to the surface narrows ahead. We must move like water through stone, slow, patient, finding every crack and opening." Standing Bear nodded, understanding the challenge they faced. The cave system that connected to the Whitmore Mansion's foundation had been carved by centuries of water flow, creating passages that were sometimes spacious, enough for easy travel, and sometimes so narrow that only a child could squeeze through. One wrong turn could lead to dead ends that would trap them underground, while Elena Morrison suffered above. Behind Standing Bear, the other 3 members of the rescue party waited in disciplined silence. Little Hawk's youthful energy was perfectly controlled, channeled into the patient watchfulness that Cherokee hunters had practiced for generations. Running Deer moved with the fluid grace of someone who understood that silence could mean the difference between life and death. Thundercloud's massive frame was deceptive. Despite his size, he could move through the caves with the stealth of a shadow, his strength held in reserve for the moment when force would be needed. "Listen," Running Deer whispered, tilting her. "Head toward the cave ceiling, where faint sounds filtered down through layers of stone and earth. Voices above, many people moving with purpose." Standing Bear strained to hear what Running Deer's more sensitive ears had detected. Years of living in hiding had taught all Cherokee to distinguish between different types of human activity, the normal sounds of daily life versus the urgent movements that suggested danger or opportunity. "White soldiers," Thundercloud said. Grimly, his knowledge of military procedures gained through bitter experience during the removal years. But also others. The sounds are wrong for a simple guard change. Standing Bear understood the implications. The presence of additional personnel in the mansion could mean that Eleanor's situation had worsened, that her interrogation was intensifying, or that federal authorities had arrived to take control of her case. Any of these possibilities made rescue more urgent and more dangerous. The cave passage ahead split into 3 directions, each leading toward different sections of the mansion's foundation. Grey Wolf studied the options with the careful attention of someone whose life had depended on making correct decisions in underground darkness for nearly 50 years. The center passage leads to the wine cellar, Grey Wolf explained in barely audible Cherokee. Too many servants, too much activity. The left passage connects to the root cellar, closer to the stone pit where the girl is held, but guarded by iron barriers the white builders installed. And the right passage? Standing, Bear asked. Grey Wolf's expression grew troubled. The right passage leads directly beneath the stone pit, but the final approach requires climbing through a vertical shaft that opens into the floor of the girl's prison. Dangerous. If we are discovered emerging, there is no retreat. Standing, Bear weighed the options with the calm deliberation that had kept his community alive through 9 years of federal persecution. The left passage offered more safety, but required dealing with iron barriers that might be impossible to breach silently. The right passage provided direct access to Elena, but left the rescue party completely vulnerable if their approach was detected. How many guards in the stone pit? Standing Bear asked. Little Hawk, who had conducted the most recent reconnaissance, considered the question carefully. The White Chief and his woman visit often to torment the girl, but they bring no guards into the stone pit itself. The guards remain above, watching the entrances and exits. But today there are more. Soldiers with authority greater than the local White Chief. Standing Bear made his decision with the finality that Cherokee leaders had learned was necessary in life or death situations. We take the right passage. Speed and surprise will serve us better than caution. If we move like spirits of the deep places, we can reach the girl before the white soldiers understand what is happening. The vertical climb through the shaft that led to Elena's cell was the most dangerous part of the entire rescue operation. The passage was barely wide enough for a human body, carved through limestone that crumbled at the slightest pressure. Handholds that seemed secure could give way without warning, sending a climber plummeting into the darkness below. Standing, Bear led the ascent, his powerful hands finding purchase on stone formations that had been shaped by thousands of years of water flow. Behind him, the other Cherokee followed with the patient precision of people who understood that one mistake would doom not just themselves, but the young woman they were risking everything to save. As they climbed higher, the sounds from above became clearer. Voices speaking in the clipped tones of military authority, footsteps moving with urgent purpose, and underneath it all, a woman's voice maintaining dignity despite obvious strain. Elena Morrison was still alive, still resisting, still holding on to the Cherokee strength her mother had taught her. "Steady," Standing Bear whispered as Thundercloud's massive frame caused loose stone to rain down from the shaft walls. "We are climbing toward justice, toward the fulfillment of debts that must be honored." 20 feet above the main cave system, Standing Bear reached a horizontal passage that Grey Wolf had described, a narrow tunnel that led directly beneath the stone floor of Eleanor's prison. Through cracks in the limestone above, faint light filtered down from the cellar, along with voices that made Standing Bear's blood run cold with rage. "Miss Morrison," a man's voice was saying with the cold authority of federal power, "your continued resistance serves no purpose except to make your eventual punishment more severe. We have methods for extracting information that will make your current discomfort seem like luxury." Elena's response came clearly through the stone, carrying the quiet strength that Standing Bear recognized as truly Cherokee. "Colonel Davidson, you can threaten whatever you like, but you cannot force me to know things I've never learned or confess to crimes I haven't committed." Standing Bear felt pride surge through his chest. Sarah White Deer's daughter was honoring her Cherokee heritage by refusing to surrender her dignity, even in the face of federal torture. Her courage deserved protection, and Cherokee law demanded that he provide it regardless of personal cost. "The floor above is thick stone," Grey Wolf whispered, joining Standing Bear in the horizontal passage. But there, he pointed to a section, where the limestone was different, older, showing the natural fractures that water had exploited over centuries. That stone can be moved if we work carefully. Standing, Bear studied the section Grey Wolf had identified. The stone was indeed different, a natural capstone that had been incorporated into the mansion's foundation but retained the fracture patterns that made it vulnerable to careful pressure applied in the right places. "How long?" Standing Bear asked. "With 4 of us working in silence, perhaps 1 hour," Grey Wolf replied. "But once we begin, there will be noise. The white soldiers above will know something is happening." Standing Bear considered the timing carefully. An hour of careful work to create an opening large enough for human passage, then the actual rescue operation in a cellar that might be filled with federal agents and local guards. The chances of success were slim, but Cherokee honor demanded. "The attempt, Little Hawk," Standing Bear whispered. "Return to the main passage and watch for any change in the sounds above. If the white soldiers move toward the stone pit, signal us immediately." Thundercloud, Running Deer, help Grey Wolf. With the stone, work like Cherokee spirits, silent as the movement of seasons, patient as the growth of trees. As his companions began the delicate task of loosening the ancient capstone, Standing Bear listened to the voices above with growing understanding of Elena's desperate situation. Federal agents were preparing to use torture to extract information she didn't possess, while Judge Whitmore pushed for immediate action that would serve his personal revenge more than any legitimate security concern. "The girl has had sufficient opportunity to cooperate voluntarily," Judge Whitmore was saying. "I recommend we proceed with enhanced interrogation immediately." Enhanced interrogation was federal language for torture justified as national security necessity. Standing Bear had heard those words before, during the removal years when Cherokee leaders were subjected to brutal questioning about tribal resources and hiding places. He knew what Elena faced if the rescue failed. Above them, Elena's voice continued to carry the dignified resistance that made Standing Bear proud to call her kin. "Judge Whitmore, your enhanced interrogation won't change the facts. I have no information about Cherokee settlements because I've had no contact with Cherokee communities since my mother's death." The work on the capstone was proceeding with agonizing slowness, each small movement requiring careful coordination to avoid creating sounds that would alert the guards above. Grey Wolf's knowledge of stone formations was proving invaluable. He could identify exactly where pressure needed to be applied to exploit natural fractures without causing sudden collapse. "Almost ready," Grey Wolf whispered, after what felt like hours but had probably been only 30 minutes. "The stone will move soon, but when it does, we must be prepared for immediate action." Standing, Bear nodded, understanding that the rescue would succeed or fail in the next few minutes. Once they emerged into Elena's cell, there would be no retreat, no second chances, no opportunity to reconsider their approach. They would face whatever forces the Whitmores had assembled with nothing but Cherokee courage and the righteousness of their cause. As the final preparations were completed, Standing Bear offered a silent prayer to the Cherokee ancestors who had faced impossible odds with dignity and determination. Sarah White Deer's daughter deserved the same protection that Cherokee warriors had always provided for their families, regardless of the personal cost. The moment of truth was approaching, and with it, a confrontation that would determine not just Elena Morrison's fate, but the future of Cherokee resistance to the corruption that had poisoned the entire region. October 17, 1847. Evening. The ancient limestone capstone gave way with a grinding whisper that seemed to echo through centuries of Cherokee presence. In these mountains, Joseph Standing Bear felt the stone shift beneath his hands as Grey Wolf applied the final pressure to the natural fracture lines that would create their entrance into Eleanor Morrison's prison. Above them, the voices of federal agents continued their threats, unaware that justice was rising from the deep places of the earth like the spirit of Cherokee ancestors demanding righteousness. "Now," Standing Bear whispered in Cherokee, and the four warriors moved the heavy stone aside with practiced silence, revealing an opening just large enough for human passage. Through the gap, they could see the stone floor of the cellar where Eleanor Morrison had maintained her dignity for 3 days, despite every attempt to break her spirit. Standing Bear emerged first, his powerful frame rising from the floor like a shadow-given substance. The cellar was dimly lit by a single lantern that cast dancing shadows on the walls, but his eyes had grown accustomed to underground darkness over the past 18 hours. He could see Elena chained to the far wall, her dress torn and dirty, but her posture still proud, her dark eyes wide with shock and recognition as she saw him appear from what had seemed solid stone. Behind Elena, 6 men stood in heated discussion. Judge Harrison Whitmore, his son Nathaniel, Agent Morrison, Colonel Davidson, Major Sterling, and Deputy Sheriff Crawford. They were so focused on their debate about interrogation methods that they hadn't noticed the quiet sounds from behind their prisoner. Elena's eyes met Standing Bear's across the cellar, and he saw in them the same strength that had characterized her mother, Sarah White Deer, the refusal to surrender one's essential self regardless of physical circumstances. But he also saw exhaustion, dehydration, and the kind of spiritual strain that came from days of resisting systematic attempts to destroy one's will. Grey Wolf emerged next, followed by Thundercloud and Running Deer. 4 Cherokee warriors now stood in the shadows of the Whitmore cellar, their presence as unexpected and unwelcome as spirits rising from a Cherokee burial ground. Standing Bear gestured for silence and patience. The rescue would proceed according to Cherokee principles of justice, not white methods of violence. "Miss Morrison," Colonel Davidson was saying, his back to the emerging Cherokee, "I'm going to ask you one final time. Provide us with information about Cherokee insurgent activities, and you'll be treated with appropriate consideration. Continue your resistance, and we'll proceed with enhanced interrogation methods." Elena's voice carried the quiet strength that Standing Bear recognized as truly Cherokee. "Colonel Davidson, I've told you repeatedly that I have no information about Cherokee insurgent activities. Your enhanced interrogation won't change that fact." Judge Whitmore stepped forward, his face flushed with frustrated rage. "Enough of this charade. The girl is obviously going to resist until we force her cooperation. I recommend we begin immediately with whatever methods are necessary." "Father," Nathaniel said with barely controlled excitement, "perhaps I could participate in the questioning. I have some experience with motivating young women to be more cooperative." The sexual threat in Nathaniel's words triggered something primal in Standing Bear's Cherokee warrior spirit. This wasn't just about rescuing Sarah White Deer's daughter. It was about confronting the kind of evil that had poisoned the entire region. The corruption that used law and authority as weapons against the innocent and powerless. Standing Bear stepped forward into the lantern light, his movement fluid and silent as a hunting cat. "Gentlemen," he said in perfect English, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent his life protecting Cherokee families from exactly this kind of persecution, "I believe this conversation is finished." The effect was immediate and dramatic. 6 men who'd believed themselves in complete control of the situation suddenly found themselves facing a Cherokee warrior who'd appeared from nowhere like a spirit of vengeance. Their shock was so complete that for several crucial seconds none of them moved or spoke. Elena's face lit up with recognition and hope. Joseph Standing Bear. she whispered in Cherokee, using the formal address her mother had taught her for. "Respected tribal leaders, Sarah White Deer's daughter," Standing Bear replied in Cherokee, "your mother's people have come to honor our obligations to family." Judge Whitmore was the first to recover from his shock, his face transitioning from confusion to rage as he realized that his careful plans were being disrupted by what he saw as savage interference. "Sheriff Crawford, arrest this man immediately. He's obviously one of the Cherokee insurgents we've been discussing," but Deputy Crawford was staring at the 4 Cherokee warriors with the wide-eyed terror of someone who understood that his weapons and authority meant nothing in the face of people who'd survived federal persecution through superior skill and determination. Crawford had heard the stories about Cherokee who'd evaded removal, ghost-like figures who could appear and disappear in the mountains like smoke, warriors who could kill a dozen men before their presence was even detected. "Your Honor," Crawford stammered, "there are 4 of them, and they appeared from the stone floor itself. How is that even possible?" Colonel Davidson reached for his sidearm, but Thundercloud moved with the fluid speed that had made Cherokee warriors legendary throughout the frontier. Before the federal agent could draw his weapon, Thundercloud's massive hand had closed around Davidson's wrist with crushing force. "Colonel," Thundercloud said in accented but clear English, "Cherokee law says that those who torture women and children forfeit the right to carry weapons." Agent Morrison tried to back toward the cellar stairs, but Running Deer blocked his path with the silent efficiency of someone who'd spent years moving unseen through hostile territory. Her presence was somehow more intimidating than open aggression. She stood perfectly still, but her dark eyes promised violence if he took another step. "This is federal authority," Major Sterling declared, trying to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. "You're interfering with a legitimate government investigation." Grey Wolf laughed, the sound carrying decades of bitter experience with federal authority and its definition of legitimacy. "Federal authority," he said with contempt. "The same federal authority that stole Cherokee land, murdered Cherokee families, forced Cherokee children into white schools where they were beaten for speaking their own language. Tell me, white soldier, what makes your authority legitimate when it serves only corruption and cruelty?" Standing Bear moved toward Eleanor while his companions maintained control over their captors. The iron shackles that held her to the wall were heavy, designed to prevent any possibility of escape through normal means. But Standing Bear hadn't spent 9 years hiding from federal authorities without learning how to deal with white man's locks and chains. From his belt, he withdrew tools that had been crafted by Cherokee smiths using traditional methods combined with practical necessity. The lockpicks were made from Cherokee silver, blessed by tribal elders, and shaped according to knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Cherokee who'd learned to survive in a world where white authority was often the enemy of justice. "Hold still, daughter of Sarah White Deer," Standing Bear said gently as he worked on the shackles. "These chains were made by men who understand only force, but Cherokee know that even the strongest bonds can be broken by those who understand the spirit of freedom." Judge Whitmore watched the rescue operation with growing rage and desperation. His careful plans for breaking Elena Morrison were collapsing, and worse, his authority was being challenged by people he'd always considered inferior and controllable. "This is intolerable," Whitmore declared. "Nathaniel, run upstairs and summon the guards. We have enough men to overwhelm these savages." But Nathaniel Whitmore was staring at Elena with an expression that mixed frustrated desire with genuine fear. For months, he'd seen her as a possession to be acquired through superior force and authority. Now he was witnessing the arrival of people who represented a kind of power he'd never understood. The strength that came from honor, family loyalty, and the refusal to surrender one's principles regardless of personal cost. "Father," Nathaniel said hesitantly. "Perhaps we should consider—" "Consider what?" Judge Whitmore snapped. "Allowing these criminals to escape? Abandoning federal law to Cherokee savages? I'd rather die than submit to such humiliation." Standing Bear looked up from Elena's shackles, his dark eyes meeting Judge Whitmore's pale ones, with an intensity that seemed to illuminate the entire cellar. "Judge Whitmore," he said with quiet authority, "you speak of federal law as if it were sacred, but you use it as a weapon against the innocent. You speak of savages, but which of us chained a young woman in a dungeon for refusing to submit to rape disguised as marriage?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a sacred fire, impossible to deny or dismiss. Elena's imprisonment had indeed been motivated by Nathaniel's sexual desires and the family's need to maintain their image of absolute authority. Furthermore, Standing Bear continued, his voice growing stronger, "you speak of Cherokee as criminals, but we're the ones who've come to rescue an innocent woman from torture. You represent federal authority, but you're the ones planning to use that authority to break someone's spirit for purely personal reasons." The first shackle opened with a quiet click that seemed to echo through the cellar like thunder. Elena gasped as feeling returned to her left arm, tears of relief streaming down her face as she realized that rescue was actually happening. Colonel Davidson tried once more to assert federal authority. "This interference with a federal investigation constitutes treason against the United States government. You'll all hang for this." Little Hawk, who had been watching the cellar entrance for additional guards, finally spoke with the passionate intensity of someone who'd grown up hearing stories about Cherokee persecution. "Federal government," he said with bitter laughter, "the same government that promised Cherokee people we could keep our land forever, then broke those promises when white settlers wanted what we had. The same government that marched Cherokee, grandmothers and children through winter snow until thousands died on your trail of tears. Tell me, white soldier, when did the federal government ever keep its word to Cherokee people?" The second shackle opened, and Elena Morrison was free for the first time in 3 days. She stumbled as her legs buckled beneath her, weakened by days of being chained in an uncomfortable position, but Standing Bear's strong arms caught her. Before she could fall, "Can you walk, daughter of Sarah White, dear?" Standing Bear asked gently. Elena straightened with effort, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I can walk," she said firmly. "I can run if necessary, and I can fight if my freedom depends on it." Standing Bear smiled with genuine pride. Sarah White Deer's daughter was indeed Cherokee in spirit as well as blood, but their escape was far from guaranteed. The cellar represented only the beginning of their journey to safety, and Judge Whitmore's mansion was filled with guards and servants who would do everything possible to prevent their departure. "Grey Wolf," Standing Bear said in Cherokee, "can we return through the deep places?" Grey Wolf shook his head grimly. "The girl is too weak for the cave journey, and they'll be watching the underground passages now. We must find another path to freedom." Thundercloud grinned with anticipation. "Then we fight our way out like Cherokee warriors. It's been too long since I had the chance to teach white soldiers about Cherokee courage." But Standing Bear was already considering a different approach, one that would serve Cherokee justice while minimizing bloodshed. He'd spent 9 years protecting his community through wisdom rather than violence, and he understood that the best victories were those that exposed evil rather than simply defeating it. Judge Whitmore, Standing Bear said formally, "Cherokee law gives you a choice. Release us peacefully, and we'll leave your territory without further conflict. Try to prevent our departure, and we'll make sure that every Cherokee community in these mountains knows how you've corrupted federal authority for personal revenge." The threat was carefully calculated. Judge Whitmore's power depended on maintaining his reputation as a legitimate representative of federal law. If Cherokee communities throughout the region began spreading stories about his corruption, his authority would crumble like stones in an earthquake. But Judge Whitmore's rage had passed beyond rational calculation. "Never," he snarled. "I'll see you all hang before I let Cherokee savages humiliate a federal judge." Standing, Bear nodded grimly. "Then Cherokee law says we fight for justice and let the spirits of our ancestors judge who represents truth." The sound of footsteps thundering down the cellar stairs announced the arrival of reinforcements. 6 guards armed with rifles and the kind of desperate courage that came from knowing their employer's reputation was at stake. But Standing Bear had anticipated this moment, had planned for exactly this kind of confrontation. "Thundercloud, take the stairs," Standing Bear commanded in Cherokee. "Running Deer, watch the prisoners. Grey Wolf, Little Hawk, follow my lead." The battle that erupted in the Whitmore cellar was unlike anything the guards had expected. They'd prepared to fight ordinary criminals or escaped slaves, not Cherokee warriors who moved like shadows and struck with the precision of mountain cats. Thundercloud met the guards at the base of the stairs, his massive frame blocking their descent, while his war club, carved from ancient Cherokee oak and blessed by tribal elders, dealt devastating blows to anyone who tried to pass. Grey Wolf and Little Hawk attacked from opposite sides of the cellar, using Cherokee fighting techniques that had been perfected through generations of warfare against superior numbers. They moved in perfect coordination, each warrior knowing instinctively where his companion would be, creating a flow of violence that seemed almost choreographed in its deadly efficiency. Standing Bear remained beside Elena, his presence both protective and reassuring as chaos erupted around them. "Stay close to me, daughter of Sarah White Deer," he said calmly. "Your mother's people know how to fight, and we know how to win." But the real shock came when Elena Morrison stepped forward, no longer the helpless victim chained to a cellar wall. In her hand, she held a piece of broken chain that she'd managed to retain when Standing Bear freed her from the shackles. Her dark eyes blazed with the same fire that had sustained Cherokee women through centuries of oppression and resistance. "Nathaniel Whitmore," she said with deadly calm, advancing toward the man who'd tried to force her into marriage. "You wanted to possess me, to break my spirit, to make me submit to your will. Let me show you what Cherokee women do to men who try to rape them." Nathaniel backed away in terror, finally understanding that Elena Morrison was no longer the frightened young woman he'd been pursuing. She was a Cherokee warrior in her own right, empowered by the rescue and the restoration of her connection to her mother's people. The fight lasted less than 10 minutes, but when it ended, 6 guards lay unconscious or groaning on the cellar floor, while the Cherokee warriors stood victorious but not vindictive. Standing Bear had taught his people that violence should serve justice, not vengeance. "Judge Whitmore," Standing Bear said, as he surveyed the aftermath of the battle, "your guards have learned something about Cherokee fighting skills. Now it's time for you to learn something about Cherokee justice." From his belt, Standing Bear withdrew a leather pouch containing sacred materials that Cherokee leaders had used for centuries to mark important moments in tribal history. Red clay mixed with Cherokee blood, charcoal from fires that had burned in Cherokee villages before removal, and white stones from the sacred places where Cherokee ancestors had prayed for generations. In Cherokee law, Standing Bear explained, as he began to paint symbols on the cellar walls, there are some crimes that require public acknowledgement, some evils that must be exposed so that the community can protect itself from future harm. The symbols he painted told the story of Elena's imprisonment in the ancient Cherokee writing system that had survived federal attempts to destroy Cherokee literacy. Future Cherokee who found these markings would understand exactly what had happened in this cellar, who had been responsible, and how justice had been served. "These marks will remain here forever," Standing Bear told Judge Whitmore, "and Cherokee people will know that this place was used for the torture of innocents. Your corruption is now part of Cherokee oral history, and Cherokee memory is longer than white man's law." Colonel Davidson, nursing a broken wrist from his encounter with Thundercloud, tried one last assertion of federal authority. "This entire episode will be reported to Washington. You'll all be hunted as enemies of the state." Standing Bear smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent 9 years evading federal manhunts. "Colonel, you're welcome to report whatever you like to Washington, but you might want to consider how your superiors will react when they learn that you assisted in the illegal imprisonment and torture of an innocent woman for the personal gratification of a corrupt judge." The truth of Standing Bear's words was undeniable. Any federal investigation of the evening's events would reveal that Eleanor Morrison had been held without proper legal authority, that her imprisonment had been motivated by personal rather than security concerns, and that federal agents had been manipulated into participating in what amounted to kidnapping and torture. As the Cherokee warriors prepared to leave the cellar, Elena Morrison stood in the center of the stone chamber, no longer a victim, but a survivor who'd reclaimed her Cherokee identity through courage and the intervention of her mother's people. "Judge Whitmore," she said with quiet dignity, "you tried to break my spirit, to force me to abandon my principles for the sake of survival. You failed. Nathaniel, you tried to make me your property through intimidation and corruption. You failed. Colonel Davidson, you tried to use federal authority to justify torture for personal revenge. You failed." She paused, looking around at the men who'd held her captive, seeing them now as the broken and defeated figures they truly were. "All of you failed because you never understood that some things can't be conquered by force, can't be bought with money, can't be destroyed by authority. You never understood that Cherokee spirit lives in the hearts of people who choose honor over comfort, justice over safety, truth over convenience." As the Cherokee party emerged from the Whitmore mansion into the cool October night, Elena Morrison breathed free air for the first time in 3 days. The stars above seemed brighter than she remembered, and the mountain wind carried the scent of Cherokee sacred plants that her mother had taught her to recognize. Standing Bear placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "Daughter of Sarah White, dear, you're free now, but freedom brings choices. You can return to your father's cabin and try to rebuild the life that was interrupted, or you can come with us to the hidden places where Cherokee culture still lives according to the old ways." Elena considered the choice carefully. Her father, Thomas Morrison, was undoubtedly worried sick about her, and she owed him the comfort of knowing she was safe. But she also understood that her rescue had marked a transformation that couldn't be undone. She was no longer just the blacksmith's daughter who happened to have Cherokee blood. She was a Cherokee woman who'd been claimed by her mother's people and welcomed into their resistance community. "I'd need to see my father first," Elena said. "He's been part of my Cherokee family since he married my mother, and he deserves to know what's happened. But after that—" She looked toward the mountains where Cherokee campfires flickered like stars brought to earth. "After that, I want to learn more about my mother's people, about the culture she wasn't able to teach me before she died." Standing Bear nodded with approval. "Cherokee law honors obligations to family, whether white or Cherokee. We'll escort you safely to your father, and when you're ready to join us in the hidden places, you'll be welcomed as the daughter of Sarah White Deer and the woman who faced federal torture without surrendering her spirit." As they walked through the night toward Thomas Morrison's cabin, Elena Morrison, now Elena Harrison, daughter of Sarah White Deer, felt the broken pieces of her identity finally coming together. She was Cherokee and white, traditional and modern, a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for too long. The chains that had bound her body were broken, but more importantly, the spiritual bonds that connected her to her Cherokee heritage had been restored through the courage of people who'd risked everything to honor their obligations to family and justice. Behind them, the Whitmore mansion stood as a symbol of corruption exposed and power challenged. The girl who had faced auction as property, who had endured imprisonment for defending her dignity, had claimed her freedom as a Cherokee woman whose spirit could not be conquered by any force in the white man's world. The darkness was ending, and with the dawn would come a new chapter in the ongoing story of Cherokee resistance to oppression, a chapter written in the courage of a young woman who discovered that her true strength came not from submitting to power, but from honoring the heritage that made submission impossible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.